Welcome to Serial Killer Files, the show where we open the casebooks on the world's darkest minds and the crimes that shook history to its core. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan. And tonight, we're taking you back a century to the shadowy streets of post-war Germany, where one man's bloodlust turned an entire city into his hunting ground. This is not folklore. It's not a ghost story whispered around campfires. It's real, and it's horrifying. It's the 1920s in Hanover. The war is over, but the wounds are fresh. The streets are flooded with orphans, drifters, and the forgotten. The perfect environment for a predator to thrive unnoticed. In this fractured world, Fritz Haarmann emerged, not just as a killer, but as something darker, something primal. A man who devoured his victims both figuratively and literally. By day, Haarmann was a charming trader, an informant for the police, even a so-called respected member of the community. But by night, he became the Butcher of Hanover, the vampire, the werewolf, a man who lured young boys into his apartment, only for them to never be seen again. Between 1918 and 1924, dozens of young men vanished. Most were poor, many were homeless. All were vulnerable. And Haarmann? He didn't just kill them, he strangled them, bit into their necks like an animal, and disposed of their bodies in ways that stunned investigators when the truth finally came out. But here's the twist that still chills to this day. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was the shadows, working with police, assisting investigations, feeding them lies while feeding his hunger behind closed doors. Tonight, we'll peel back the mask of civility that Haarmann wore so well. We'll dive into his disturbing upbringing, his manipulative charm, and the gut-wrenching details of what he did to his victims once he got them alone. We'll also examine the police failures, the social chaos, and the unanswered questions that still linger in the bloody margins of this case. Because Fritz Haarmann's story isn't just about murder. It's about the monsters we don't see, because we don't want to see them. So lock your doors, turn down the lights, and listen closely. Because once you know what happened in Hanover, you'll never look at a friendly face the same way again. This is Serial Killer Files, brought to you by Skoob, and this is the case of Fritz Haarmann. Every monster has an origin story. And Fritz Haarmann's begins in the grim household of Solkiola, his father's ominous nickname. From the earliest age, young Fritz displayed behaviors that terrified even his physically abusive father. Imagine a parent so concerned about their child's violent tendencies that they desperately plead with medical professionals to institutionalize them. That was Fritz's father, a man who recognized danger when he saw it. Fritz wasn't just a difficult child, he was deeply disturbed. His aggression toward other children was relentless and unpredictable. In conservative society, his habit of wearing his sister's clothing raised additional alarm bells. These weren't simple childhood quirks. They were warning signals of psychological fractures that would eventually shatter completely. The most tragic aspect, his father's pleas for help were ignored. Medical authorities examined Fritz and concluded he wasn't a threat. This catastrophic oversight would haunt Hanover for decades to come. Fritz struggled with impulse control, displayed low intelligence, and couldn't conform to basic societal expectations. Yet he remained free, his instability dismissed by those who should have recognized the warning signs. At 16, his family made one final attempt at salvation, enrolling him in military school. But Fritz's problems manifested physically. He began exhibiting symptoms of epilepsy, leading to his swift discharge. Rather than finding structure, he returned to Hanover, where accusations of child molestation immediately surfaced. Authorities finally took action, confining him to an asylum for psychiatric evaluation. But Fritz was cunning. After 6 months, he escaped, avoiding accountability once again. Freedom only emboldened him. He dove deeper into criminal behavior, theft, fraud, and continued exploitation of children. Around 1900, Fritz briefly attempted normalcy, becoming engaged to a local woman. When she became pregnant, rather than accepting responsibility, he fled to the military, serving until 1903. His return to Hanover wasn't welcomed. His father still believed institutionalization was necessary. But Fritz had mastered manipulation, exploiting legal loopholes to avoid confinement. His father made one last attempt to save him, establishing a fish and chips business for Fritz to manage. But Fritz embezzled the funds and sabotaged his own future. By 1914, caught breaking into a warehouse, he received a 5-year prison sentence. Incarceration, however, was merely a pause in his criminal education. Fritz Haarmann's release in 1918 coincided perfectly with Germany's post-war chaos. Hanover was a city in turmoil. Black markets flourished, law enforcement struggled, and societal structures had weakened considerably. For a predator like Haarmann, these conditions were ideal. He immediately entrenched himself in illegal activities, aligning with local smuggling rings and accumulating both income and social standing. But his masterstroke was fashioning himself as Detective Haarmann, a police informant who gained the community's trust while hiding his darkest impulses. This deceptive role was brilliantly calculated. In a city teeming with war refugees and runaway youth, Haarmann positioned himself as a helpful figure at Hanover's railway station, approaching homeless boys with promises of shelter. His false authority allowed him to operate with impunity, exploiting both criminal and law enforcement circles. The transformation from petty criminal to serial killer wasn't immediate. It was catalyzed by a relationship that would prove deadly for dozens of young men. In 1919, after serving 9 months for indecency with a minor, Haarmann moved to a new dwelling and met Hans Granz, a 24-year-old involved in theft and prostitution. Their partnership was both romantic and criminal. Under Granz's influence, Haarmann shifted from mere theft and molestation to murder. Granz would later play a crucial role in victim selection and disposing of evidence, creating a killing partnership that terrorized Hanover for years. Haarmann's method was as personal as it was brutal. He described biting through victims' throats, a horrifying reflection of the sadistic pleasure he derived from killing. Once dead, victims were dismembered with butcher's precision, their flesh sold on the black market as pork or beef, while remaining evidence was dumped in the River Line. The audacity was staggering. Haarmann operated a small butcher shop where unsuspecting customers purchased human flesh. His shop always had prime meat cuts when other establishments faced shortages, a fact that should have raised suspicions, but instead boosted his business. Fritz Haarmann was methodical in selecting his victims. He targeted society's most vulnerable: runaways, male prostitutes, and homeless young men between the ages of 11 and 22. These individuals, Haarmann calculated, wouldn't attract immediate attention if they disappeared. Their marginalized status provided him with perfect cover. The systematic nature of his victim selection reveals a calculating mind beneath the apparent madness. Hans Granz played a disturbing role in this process, sometimes specifically requesting that certain boys be killed, particularly when he coveted their clothing or possessions. Let me walk you through the horrifying timeline of known victims, beginning with 17-year-old Friedel Rothe, who vanished on September 25, 1918. Rothe's disappearance brought police to investigate Haarmann's apartment, but they found nothing concrete. Later, Haarmann would admit that Rothe's severed head was hidden behind the stove during that very search, a chilling example of how close authorities came to stopping the killing spree before it truly began. After Rove, there was a significant pause, a hiatus that demonstrates Haarmann's ability to control his urges when necessary. The killing resumed with devastating intensity in 1923. Fritz Franke, 16, disappeared on February 12th. Wilhelm Schulze, 17, vanished on March 20th. The pace accelerated terrifyingly. May 1923 brought multiple victims. Roland Huch, a 15-year-old student who disappeared from Hanover railway station, and Hans Sonnenfeld, an 18-year-old runaway. June claimed 13-year-old Ernst Ehrenberg, who vanished while running an errand. August saw the disappearance of Heinrich Strauss, whose violin case would later be found in Haarmann's possession, a tragic memento of a young life cut short. The autumn of 1923 was particularly deadly. September brought 17-year-old Paul Broniszewski and Richard Graf. October claimed 3 victims: Wilhelm Erdner, whose bicycle Haarmann sold after the murder; Hermann Wolf, whose clothing directly linked back to Haarmann; and 13-year-old Heinz Brinkmann, another child who vanished from the railway station. November witnessed the disappearance of Adolf Hanover, a 15-year-old apprentice whose case would later involve Hans Grans directly. December added Adolf Hennies, 19, who vanished while job hunting, a cruel irony given his hopeful circumstances. 1924 continued the horror. Ernst Speicher disappeared while traveling to testify in a trial. Heinrich Koch, known to associate with Haarmann, vanished in January. The spring months brought more victims: Hermann Speichert, an apprentice electrician; Alfred Hogreff, an apprentice mechanic; Hermann Bock, last seen near Haarmann's apartment. The final documented victim was Heinz Martin, a 14-year-old apprentice locksmith who disappeared from Hanover Station on May 9, 1924. Each name represents a family destroyed, dreams shattered, and a community traumatized by incomprehensible loss. What made Fritz Haarmann particularly terrifying wasn't just that he killed, it was how he killed and what he did afterward. His own confession provides a horrifying window into the mind of a monster, delivered with a casualness that chills the blood. Haarmann insisted his intention was never to kill, claiming some victims had visited before and he felt compelled to warn them away, somehow knowing the likely outcome. But when control slipped away, the violence was savage and personal. He described biting his victims' necks and engaging in what he called terminal sex and breath play, forms of sexual asphyxiation that could last for hours. The killing itself was brutally intimate. Haarmann would bite into victims' Adam's apples while simultaneously throttling them with his hands, throwing his full weight onto the exhausted young men until they suffocated. Afterward, he would collapse on their lifeless bodies before beginning the grisly process of disposal. His methodology afterward reveals a practiced efficiency that suggests this wasn't impulsive madness, but calculated brutality. First, he would prepare strong black coffee, a ritualistic element that speaks to the psychological aspects of his crimes. Then came the methodical dismemberment. The body would be laid on the floor with a cloth draped over the face to avoid its gaze. Using precise surgical incisions, he would open the abdomen and dispose of intestines in a bucket. He would repeatedly dip towels into the abdomen, absorbing as much blood as possible. Waste not, want not in Haarmann's twisted economy. The dismemberment followed a specific pattern. 3 cuts from ribs toward shoulders, then forceful bending until ribs fractured at the shoulder line. This allowed extraction of heart, lungs, and kidneys, which were chopped and placed in buckets. Limbs were dismembered systematically, legs first, then arms. Flesh was carefully removed from bones and stored in waxed cloth bags or hidden under beds and in small compartments. Disposal required multiple trips, 5 or 6 journeys to flush remains down toilets or dump them in the river. Even the most intimate parts weren't spared from this systematic destruction. Despite claiming to hate this aspect, Haarmann admitted that a stronger obsession overpowered his revulsion. He saved the heads for last, perhaps the most personal aspect of his ritual. Scalps were peeled with small kitchen knives, sliced into strips and squares with methodical precision. Skulls were placed face down on straw mats, wrapped in rags to muffle noise as he shattered them with an axe's blunt side until they separated along joints. Brains went into buckets while bone fragments were disposed of in the river by the castle. The victim's clothing became merchandise, either given away or sold, adding a commercial element to the horror. This wasn't just murder. It was a comprehensive business model built on human destruction. By 1924, Fritz Haarmann's reign of terror was approaching its end, though he didn't know it yet. The evidence of his crimes was literally surfacing from the depths of the river line, creating a trail of horror that would finally lead authorities to his door. The beginning of the end started with children playing near the riverbank in May 1924. They discovered a sack of bones, a grisly find that initially seemed like an isolated incident. Perhaps a suicide, police thought, or a random crime. But as June progressed, more human remains were found either floating in the river or washed ashore along its banks. Police realized they weren't dealing with isolated incidents, but something far more sinister. A dedicated team organized a thorough search of the river Leen, and what they discovered defied belief. Over 500 bones were recovered, belonging to at least 22 different individuals. Analysis revealed these weren't random victims. The bones primarily belonged to younger males, specifically teenagers and children. The investigation intensified as 2 more victims disappeared in the spring of 1924. Fritz Wittig, 17, vanished on May 26th, followed by 11-year-old Friedrich Abeling on the same day. Abeling's remains would later be found dumped in the Leine River, adding to the growing body of evidence. June brought another disappearance. Heinrich Koch, 16, was last seen with Haarmann while traveling to college. Then Eric de Vries, 17, vanished on June 14th. After Haarmann's eventual arrest, he would personally lead police to de Vries' remains, a final twisted cooperation. Given Haarmann's criminal history and his known association with police as an informant, authorities began viewing him as more than just a witness or helper. His background, combined with his frequent presence around missing persons cases, made him a prime suspect. The Hanover police placed him under surveillance. The trap closed on June 22, 1924, when law enforcement officials observed Haarmann at the local railroad station, his familiar hunting ground, attempting to lure yet another young boy to his residence. This behavior, now viewed through the lens of suspicion rather than cooperation, led to his immediate arrest. The search of Haarmann's apartment revealed a scene from a nightmare. Investigators were confronted with walls and floors stained with blood, and bloody clothing belonging to missing boys scattered throughout the residence. When confronted with this evidence, Haarmann attempted to explain it away, claiming he was merely an illegal butcher, technically correct, but omitting the horrifying truth about what kind of meat he was processing. Under interrogation, Fritz Haarmann's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled. The man who had spent years deceiving police, community members, and even his own customers began revealing the full extent of his crimes. His confession was delivered with a casualness that horrified investigators. He spoke of 30 or 40 murders as if discussing the weather. Haarmann admitted to a systematic pattern of abduction, sexual assault, murder, and dismemberment that had continued since 1918. While items found at his residence suggested connections to approximately 100 missing boys, police managed to conclusively link him to 27 murders through physical evidence and his own admissions. The investigation revealed the true scope of Haarmann's deception. He had spent years inserting himself into investigations of missing children, feigning assistance to grieving parents while knowing exactly what had happened to their sons. His confidence wasn't born of innocence, but of intimate knowledge. He was helping investigate crimes he had committed. On one occasion, when suspicions had mounted and authorities tested meat from his shop, it was mistakenly identified as pork, allowing Haarmann's brutality to continue undetected. The irony was devastating. The evidence was literally in hand, but forensic limitations of the era prevented proper identification. Fritz Haarmann's trial began on December 4, 1924, and immediately became one of Germany's most sensational media spectacles. The courtroom was packed daily as journalists struggled to find adequate descriptions for the defendant. Terms like Wolfman, Werewolf, and the Vampire of Hanover emerged from this coverage, each attempting to capture the inhuman nature of his crimes. The trial lasted 2 weeks, during which Haarmann displayed disturbing composure. He smoked cigars throughout proceedings and expressed annoyance about women's presence in the courtroom, a final display of the entitlement and control issues that had driven his crimes. Hans Grans faced charges alongside Haarmann, accused of inciting murder based on Haarmann's initial confession. The evidence suggested Grans had specifically requested certain victims be killed, particularly when he coveted their possessions. However, in a final twist, Haarmann wrote a letter before his execution asserting Grans' innocence, complicating the case against his former lover. On December 19, 1924, the court found Haarmann guilty of 24 murder charges out of the 27 presented by prosecutors. Despite debates about his mental fitness for trial, his previous successful escapes from psychological evaluation supported the guilty verdict. The sentence was death by beheading, a method chosen for its supposed humanitarian qualities. Grans faced a retrial following Haarmann's letter and received a 12-year prison sentence. After his release, he spent the remainder of his life in Hanover, maintaining a low profile until his death in the 1980s. His survival provided an eerie epilogue to the case, the accomplice outliving his more notorious partner by decades. On April 15, 1925, Fritz Haarmann met his end by beheading, but even death couldn't end the scientific curiosity surrounding his case. His brain was preserved and sent to Göttingen Medical School for research, where it remains today, a macabre specimen in humanity's attempt to understand incomprehensible evil. The case left Hanover forever changed. Estimates suggest Haarmann's victim count ranged from 24 confirmed murders to possibly 50 or more, but newspapers noted that around 600 boys had vanished in Hanover during 1924 alone, the year Haarmann's crimes were first exposed. In a city of roughly 450,000 people, the statistical impact was staggering. When news of Haarmann's crimes and cannibalistic butcher shop broke, the horror extended beyond the confirmed victims. Many patrons of his shop undoubtedly wondered if they had unknowingly consumed human flesh. The psychological trauma rippled through the community. Customers who had praised the quality of his meat now faced the possibility that they had become unwitting cannibals. The case prompted significant debates about criminal justice, mental health, and police procedures. Some criticized the investigative focus on homosexuality, arguing that such discrimination made homosexual men more vulnerable targets while simultaneously making their murders less likely to receive thorough investigation. Psychologists debated whether societal non-acceptance of homosexuality could trigger mental health issues that escalated to violence. Others examined how Haarmann's role as a police informant had provided perfect cover for his crimes, raising questions about law enforcement's reliance on criminals for information. The case became a catalyst for discussions about the death penalty and protocols for handling potentially mentally unstable suspects. While immediate policy reforms didn't occur, these discussions prompted deeper examination of criminal psychology and investigative procedures. As we conclude this journey into one of history's darkest chapters, we're left with disturbing questions about the nature of evil and societies to protect its most vulnerable members. Fritz Haarmann's case wasn't just about one man's depravity. It was about systemic failures that allowed a predator to operate with impunity for years. The warning signs were there from childhood. His father recognized the danger and pleaded for intervention, but medical professionals dismissed the threat. Military institutions couldn't contain him. Law enforcement inadvertently provided him with cover by accepting him as an informant. Each failure compounded into tragedy. R.E.L. Masters and Edward Lee, in their work Perverse Crimes in History, struggled to categorize Haarmann. Was he a vampire, a werewolf, a sadist? Their conclusion was that while vampire might be feasible, he was more accurately described as a homosexual sadist, a lust murderer, and undoubtedly a cannibal. But even these clinical terms fail to capture the full horror of his actions. The vampire of Hanover represents more than individual evil. He embodies societal vulnerabilities that still exist today. Marginalized youth remain at risk. Predators still exploit positions of trust. Warning signs are still sometimes ignored or dismissed. Haarmann's victims were society's forgotten, runaways, homeless youth, those struggling on the margins. Their disappearances initially attracted little attention precisely because they were vulnerable. This tragic reality continues in modern cases worldwide, where missing persons from marginalized communities receive less media attention and fewer investigative resources. The case reminds us that monsters don't always look like monsters. Haarmann operated a business, helped police investigations, and maintained community relationships. Evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears the mask of helpfulness and respectability. Today, Fritz Haarmann's name remains synonymous with incomprehensible horror. His crimes challenged our understanding of human nature and forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability, authority, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. You've heard the facts, the horror, the cracks in the system that let a monster move unchecked through a broken world. You've seen how one man's evil fed off silence, and how society's blind eye can be just as deadly as the hands that kill. Now you choose what to believe. Was Fritz Haarmann a lone predator born from chaos, or a product of a deeper rot hiding within institutions meant to protect us? Maybe the only truth that matters is that it happened. And it could happen again. If you're ready to dive deeper into Fritz Haarmann's case, download the Skoob app on the App Store or Google Play for more content. Thank you for walking this cold path with me. Remember, evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it shakes your hand. And sometimes it helps you look for the very people it's already taken. Until next time, this has been Serial Killer Files. Stay sharp, stay aware, and don't ever assume the monster is gone just because the story is over.